Going to continue with assembling the tail drive. Left off, I was just had all this positioned. So now what I'm going to have to do is glue the bearings into place on the tail drive shaft, and it actually does cover this in the instructions and shows to use some CA glue. Okay, so what I was saying, start off by pulling the cup out of the way and slide the bearing forward on the shaft, and applying a bit of glue to the shaft. And I basically just hold the tip to it and then spin it around on it. And you press the bearing past onto the glue. The reason why I do this from the back side, not the front side of the bearing in terms of applying the glue, is so that when I go to press this shaft into the tail boom, it will hold in place, because it's actually pressing into the layer of glue that's there. So let's see if I can get enough light to show. It basically just makes a little cone of glue there. Provided that you haven't used too much, it should never get outside of the inner section of the bearing. So you want to be very, very careful to only use a little bit of glue there. Now I just temporarily put the cup onto the bearing and move to the next one. Sometimes the cup's not going to want to leave it. In that case, usually because of the way these cups sit on here, you can just kind of walk it off the bearing without having the bearing glued. So now I'm going to check my spacing again, pull the bearing up, try to do this with the best light. You can actually just squeeze a little bit on and then squish it around with the tip of the bottle so that you get it even. You can see how little there is, and I gotta move pretty quickly here to get the bearing pressed onto that. You also want to make sure that when it spins, it doesn't spin too bad through the bearings, because you can end up putting one of these bearings offset. You can also take the bearing and spin the shaft to make sure that the bearing doesn't wobble around. Back to putting the cap back on there. The other thing you can do is you can take a small slotted screwdriver and apply the glue with it. Put a drop of glue onto the screwdriver and then use the screwdriver to spread it around. And you'll note that glue that I'm using here, right, I can get the light to focus on it, is actually Hobby tire glue. It's actually rubberized. Basically just has rubber powder in regular cyanoacrylate. It makes it cure really, really fast. But the upside is that it becomes a little bit more flexible than regular CA. And that right there was the front bearing. You'll note that it's very close to the end of the shaft here, because when you stack things up on it, take the gear, the front boom brace that it's going to be going through, front boom block that's going to be going through, it's going to be sitting right there, and there's the other bearing right here at the front. Having it there, like I said, supports the pinion from being able to flex away from the main gear. So you can see how you can wiggle around like this within that front bearing. This keeps the load down so that bearing doesn't wear out quicker. Keeps it a radial load instead of an off-angle, off-axis load. Now the next thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to go right back to the back bearing, pull the cup off of it, and then start getting these bearings ready to glue the cups into place on them. The instruction manual does not say to glue the cups on. I've found it's kind of necessary to glue them on, or the darn things tend to walk off when you're changing up conicals later on and during crash damage and so forth. And once these things come off, the support bearing is no longer doing any good. It can just wiggle around and wobble around, and it makes all kinds of racket. So what I typically do is I set the bearing cup on the bearing just a little ways, and then I add a little bit of glue around the outside edge. And I do that while spinning the cup. What that allows me to do is keep the glue from wanting to walk into the center of the race and stay on the outside. Also, what I do later on is I take these cups and I very, very slightly sand them from the front to the back as I'm pushing them into the boom, so that I get them so that they're snug but not so grippy that they tear the bearings off of the boom, or tear the bearings off of the drive shaft and allow them to move around. Once again, this is another section where you can apply the glue to a screwdriver first, and that'd be probably what I'd recommend for most people to do. I've done this quite a bit, so I tend to just wing it and do it whatever way that feels comfortable at the time. I push that cup onto the bearing and then wait for that to cure. Save ourselves a little bit more sanding later. You can take a paper towel here and just roll off the excess. And provided that you've not used too much glue, it should never hit the inner bearing race. And that's where it can become tricky, and like I said, applying it with a small screwdriver can be really beneficial on these. The other thing you can do is you can just apply it part way around, and then take a slotted screwdriver and work it the rest of the way around. Which is what I'm going to do here, because I'm kind of not used to it. Okay, I'm not sure why the camera stopped right then, but what I was saying is it's a little difficult to do with the camera in the way. Good idea to check to make sure each of the bearings still spins free.